Go ahead.
What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to the. We already did a show today. I'm already off kilter with it. Let me start that one more time. What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to the shop. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the Dynasty Diagnostic podcast. My name is Eitan Mozia. You can find me on Twitter at Eitan Alive. I am joined by Sam Elaine. You can find him at FF Stompy. We love talking Dynasty on this podcast, but love fantasy even more. And as a whole, must recognize the major edges to be had in gaining a deeper understand about the different formats of this great game that we all play, that we all enjoy, and that we can all actually do during this coronavirus quarantine. So we brought in one of the best experts on the DFS side of the table to talk us through his poker career, prove why Stewie Griffin is the best Twitter Avi ever, and give us some little nuggets of wisdom here and there that we can pair with our long-term outlooks on players with some cold, calculated game-to-game analysis. Please welcome a true big dog of the fantasy space, Mr. TJ Hernandez.
Guys, what's up? Did I see correctly that I'm following Barry?
Yes, you did.
Damn,
that might happen.
That's like coming in. That's like trying to go on stage behind Richard Pryor. What are you guys doing?
Right? Should have been our
can't follow that, man.
Our off-season ender should have been Matthew Berry. I don't know, man. You've made a name. You've made a name for yourself, and I think you're. I mean, maybe not as recognizable, but you're extremely recognizable. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, man. Of course, anytime. I'm my podcast chops are a little rusty. This is only my second one of the calendar year, so I'm ready to dust it off a little bit.
Well, we're honored, man.
Absolutely, we're happy to have you for the second one of the year, but. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are out there, if you are a best ball player, if you just want to know about how to think about the game of fantasy as a whole, if you want to talk to a pro gambler that has taken some of those skills into the fantasy space and has used that to differentiate some of his content and actually has risen to the level of a director at a very, very well-respected site at 4for4, please go ahead and follow TJ Hernandez on Twitter. You can find him at TJ Hernandez. Again, the Stewie Griffin Avi is what you want to look out for. So let's get right into it. But, just to kind of set the tone here before we get into this, TJ, I wanted to make sure that you understood how the Dynasty Diagnostic goes. We are true professionals here. I want the cold, hard truth, nothing but the facts here. And I've already sent a 12-pack of the hoppiest IPA I could find to your household. I want you off kilter, man. Are you ready?
No, I'm not accepting any packages during this pandemic. It's not sanitary. It's not healthy. So unfortunately, I can't be accepting that right now.
Yeah, it's probably good. He probably licked all the tops just taking that guy.
Oh, yeah, nothing without an Amazon label goes through the door. So sorry, that's just gonna have to rot out in the San Diego sun.
I don't know, man. You would think maybe that those IBUs are so powerful that they're just like resistant to any bacteria or viruses. You never know.
Yeah, I mean, the way it's just rotting people's stomach and brains, you would think it could hold up to
Oh boy.
Oh man, all the shade thrown the way of the IPA. I absolutely love it. But I mean, before we even get into the football side of things, man, I just want to kind of get a little bit of a view into your thought process and how you've actually kind of developed these edges as a gambler now into looking at things from a fantasy perspective. So let's talk about your poker career a little bit before we get into it. Tell me about it, man. How'd you get into it? Why'd you get into it? What did you find so appealing?
Yeah, the term career you got to use pretty loosely. In context, like the time 08, 09, it was just kind of a different poker universe at the time. I was what was known back in the day as a rakeback grinder. So I was okay at poker, but compared to dudes that were really crushing, I mean, I was paying bills with bonuses essentially, and then with a little bit extra off the poker side of it. But I mean, my story isn't uncommon from a lot of people my age or around that time. I graduated college in '08 with a finance degree, and for anybody that has been alive that long, that was probably the worst time in history to graduate with a finance degree. So at the time, like the finance jobs listed on this was when you could still go on Craigslist at the time, and it was still a legitimate like job site. Everything was like door-to-door sales basically. So I was waiting tables to pay my way through college, and that extended to not being able to find a job in finance. And I stumbled along across online poker while I was in college, kind of like a lot of people did during that early 2000s boom. By 2009, 2010, I was making more money online poker than I was waiting tables. So naturally, I stopped waiting tables. I moved to Vegas shortly after, and 4 months after that, Black Friday hit, and I was no longer allowed to play online poker.
Yeah, that's rough, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, that December 2008 collapse was huge for everybody, and kind of was the second great recession we've had in a little while. I hope that what we're seeing now doesn't necessarily get to those levels. I don't think it is, because I think we've seen some rebounds lately, but I mean, that's all because we've seen a lot of a Keynesian view when it comes to getting the economy to even stay somewhat solvent.
Do you know what you're talking about?
Yes, we've been pumping a lot of money.
No. Do you know what? Okay, sorry. Do you know what TJ was talking about?
TJ was talking about the recession.
No, he was talking about Black Friday for online poker.
No, he went to Black Friday. He said Black Friday was the time that you stopped playing poker, right?
Yeah.
But the recession was why you couldn't find the job.
Right.
Oh, that one. Yeah. Right. I'm just trying to make a fool of you in front of TJ.
Yeah. No. I understand what I'm talking about, Sam. Anyway, what I was saying was a lot of money is being pumped into the economy right now with not much backing it. So, I mean, we'll see what happens this time around, but I hope it doesn't reach the same levels of what we saw there. But, going back to poker, I mean, at least it had to be a whirlwind 4 months. It had to kind of be something that maybe was new to you, that was exciting at that time. I wanted to ask, how far did it go? You said you moved out to Vegas, so I mean, I have to assume that you were in some pretty decent profile tournaments out there. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the Vegas thing was actually a little bit disconnected from the online poker thing, because I was playing primarily online. So the Vegas thing was more just like of a let me go to a city that I hadn't been to. I had been to San Diego for 6 years at the time, and just with my background in bartending and poker, it just kind of seemed like a natural place to go, and it was a lot more affordable. So at the time, I was trying to make it as a poker player. It all just kind of made sense. So I was still playing primarily online as a cash game player. So I didn't dip my toes too much into the tournament waters. And like I said, I was playing online after Black Friday. I was grinding cash games a little bit, but I almost immediately found a full-time job, so I wasn't relying on live games. But I hung around the World Series the couple times I was out there, mostly playing cash games. I played one prelim 1500 event. That's the only World Series event I've ever played, and didn't do well in it. So I've never been much of a tournament guy, which is, I mean, it makes sense that my transition in fantasy was slowly crept to exclusively DFS. So my life theme is I like to be able to walk away whenever I want to.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That does make a lot of sense. But I mean, there is still some overlap, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think gave you the biggest edge, even if you're not necessarily at a table and you can't read body language and all the rest of it? What made your style different and allowed you to win even as often as you did?
Yeah, I mean, what I came to find out was after a couple years of living in Vegas and being forced to play, is that I'm just a better live player than online player, and that just has to do with the fact that I was playing lower stakes up to just like 2-5 or 5-5, depending on if you're in California or Nevada. But I mean, it's just the skill level of low stakes live compared to low stakes online is night and day. A live game, a lot of people are probably going to be better live players if they're playing. If they have some kind of skill level in playing those lower stakes games, especially in a tourist city. But I mean, really, it's just about my advantage has always been patience. I mean, even like the most successful people that are much better at poker than myself, you hear these stories about people getting bored, people being card dead, people playing, just kind of off the rails a little bit. And I mean, to me, I've always kind of had that it doesn't make sense to go off the script, or at least for no reason to go way off the script. So I mean, and you probably cost yourself a little bit of edge and a little bit of money with being so strict with that. But again, if you were playing those lower stakes, especially at the time, you could really just sit back, play your game. And if like I was playing the local casinos off the strip a little bit, you would get like these same like 50 to 100 locals just filtering through that have never changed their game in 40 years. You could kind of just sit back and pick that apart. So I mean, patience really.
Hey man, patience is a virtue, they say, and it's been proven time and time again. And I guess you can kind of do the same thing with your bankroll in a season with DFS.
Yeah.
It's just about playing the right games at the right times and figuring out, when you've gotten in too deep, when it's starting to get emotional, and pulling yourself out at that time. So I definitely do respect that, and I understand that, and I'm glad that you were able to share that with us. I think that's very applicable to what we're doing with Dynasty. I mean, it's the long game entirely. So again, patience is something that you really, really need to have in spades if you want to be able to consistently win. So you mentioned though that live games were a lot more profitable for you than the online games. And so I want to go directly into why was that? Did you have like a killer poker face? Did you have the shades on with the hoodie on and all the rest of it? Like, what were you doing that kind of gave you that edge in live games in person?
I think one of my this probably goes more than just poker. Probably one of my biggest gifts and curses in life is just kind of my general sense of apathy. So when you put that at a poker table, it looks like I'm not tilting, and I can fire off some what looks like crazy bets and get looked up, or peel off a couple buy-ins even if I'm playing well, and look like I'm not tilting. And I think when people see that and you look like the crazy player in terms of how you're playing, but you are also the calmest player at the table, that messes with people in a live game regardless of what they say. And you could kind of feel the energy shift, especially when you start getting in your flow and you're playing every day. So that calmness, which is it's kind of the duck on the water, like it looks calm, but underneath it's going crazy. That's kind of my sense, and you start picking up on that, realizing that it's messing with people. So that's I would say that I don't have like a specific story of it, but I've sat at many a table and you could feel people getting bothered. And one of the it's not a specific, I don't have a good story in mind, but one of the biggest points that I'm pretty sure it was Daniel Legrand. He was talking about in some interview a long time ago. He'll talk to anybody at the poker table, be super cordial, but he'll never answer a question about poker or about the game specifically. So in a game, people ask me what I had, what I didn't have, and most people aren't comfortable saying nothing where I am. And that messes with people, and they'll ask you about a football game, and you're super talkative and super nice, and they kind of all of a sudden they realize it, and then they'll keep trying to pry, and it never works, and it breaks them. Your silence can break people down. It's pretty crazy.
I love that. I love putting people on tilt by not necessarily showing your hand at all emotionally.
Nuts, man.
Oh yeah. I can definitely understand how that would work at a table. So let's get away from that. Let's talk about what the crossover is from poker to DFS. Obviously, you're very analytically minded. You're very good with numbers. You just mentioned that you went to school for finance. So, I mean, obviously, you're kind of weighing above probably what the majority of people out there playing fantasy are. So what do you think has been the main thing that maybe you learned in that limited past life that you use now on a day-to-day basis?
Probably, yeah. Definitely the most obvious one is just understanding variance, and you can give all these math equations and help people like show them on a spreadsheet or in an article like what a standard deviation is and what your expectation could be over the long run. But having that background of being able to sit at an online table or sit at a live table and have 10 buy-in swings, have swings for thousands of dollars that online might last a couple weeks, live might last a couple months. Those lessons definitely translate to DFS, especially if you're somebody that plays exclusively NFL like I do, where you can easily have losing weeks, months, if not seasons, just because of the nature of NFL. You only basically, I mean, you could play different slates and whatnot, but you basically only get 17 trials a year. So understanding that you could be a very profitable, very winning player, that kind of just helps you stay to the process, understand how to step back. And then secondary, I mean, just game selection. Learning going into DFS, and I was probably a little late bloomer compared to some of the other top names, just behind by a couple of years. But understanding game selection, like what to look for and those types of things is, I mean, I think that's probably one of the biggest leaks still to this day of the best players and of new players, understanding game selection.
I love that. I love that. You need to understand what you're walking into, what situation you're walking into, and have the information available to keep yourself calm in those moments where it seems like everything is going against you. So That's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. Describe your rise to the director of DFS on such a respected platform. Obviously, 4 for 4 is huge in the industry. There's tons of people that are still there, that came through there, that are going on to do even other things now. I have to think that you kind of started writing kind of like the rest of us, and maybe didn't necessarily have all the connections that you've eventually made over time. Describe to me kind of just, what your story was and what your pathway was to get to there specifically.
Yeah, and in a roundabout way, I look back on it and not being able to find a job and getting into poker and it not working out was really the best thing that ever happened to me. I mean, it's just one of those situations where I just kind of went after the thing that was in front of me and let the cards fall as they may, no pun intended. But through poker and through some of the training sites that I was involved in, even before DFS blew up, there was just a lot of natural transition of all of us nerds that like to play poker staring at screens also playing fantasy football. So even before I was seriously into fantasy football, I was always kind of dishing with some poker dudes about fantasy in general. And then when DFS started popping, just kind of getting just kind of us trying to figure out what this was all about. And a guy that worked for, at the time, Deuces Cracked is one of the major training sites of poker, that worked for Deuces Cracked. Him and I were probably closest in terms of just talking about fantasy. And he had some friends or knew of some guys that were looking for writers at the time. And he had actually at the time started a very small operator that had a DFS leg that branched off of a major horse betting site. And I was bugging him, sending him blogs like, listen, man, you need content. I could help you with this. And he kind of was like, I don't have time or want for that. So luckily, because I did that in my own free time, when these guys looking for writers came about, he pointed me in that direction. It happened to be Ryan Hodge and Dave Lockram. They said, we don't have any money for you, but your blog looks cool. We want to contribute. And I wasn't doing. I was doing it in my free time. I was doing it because I liked it, because it was fun, and because I was making money at DFS. And I had this background in poker training sites and knew that advice is a thing that people would eventually be looking for, and started without anybody asking me to. So the short story is it just kind of snowballed. I wasn't looking for a career. It turned into one, obviously. I was doing it for free, which is still to this day kind of a big talking point and a point of contention among a lot of people. And obviously the landscape is a lot different right now than it was in 2013, but I just liked it. And my goal wasn't to be a director of DFS at 4 for 4. My goal wasn't to even have a career. My goal was to watch football on Fridays and somehow get paid for it. And that was my on Sundays. I'm sorry, not Fridays. Watch football on Sundays and get paid for it. And I saw that as the avenue for that.
A lot of respect to you, because I'm good at fantasy football in most formats. I am atrocious at DFS because I'm like, oh yeah, that's the obvious play. And then I'll make the obvious play. And I'm like, I don't make those 1% plays because I'm just,
And here's a little secret about DFS. Nobody's good.
Okay, fair enough.
If you look at the win rates of the best players in the world, these are thin margins we're pushing here. So I mean, if you're somebody that's winning 60% of your head-to-head, you're a really damn good DFS player. That means you're losing 40% of the time. And with the technologies out there and the smart people and the projections, somebody that doesn't know anything about DFS can probably put together a 50th percentile lineup just by accidentally clicking on a lot of sites.
So what you're trying to say is Jonathan Bales ruined it for everybody.
Bales is my dude, man. You know what he was doing. You see, start doing so many damn push-ups.
We have to talk about that, man. How did that even become like as big as it did, as quickly as it did? Was it just the personality?
Because anything Bales does and promotes turns into freaking gold and it's annoying.
Man, I love it. I got to get that guy's ear somehow. I might come after you. I might come after you.
All
right. All right. So let's get into what we're going to talk about today. Let's get into our 5-point inspection. What is the single most actionable piece of data that will put you either off or on selecting a player in a given game? And then talk to me about game selection as well. I know nothing about game selection. So talk to me about some of the principles of that as well that you think have made you a better DFS player over time.
Yeah, if we're talking strictly DFS here, I mean, there's not a magic formula to DFS. I mean, the first thing you can really do is this goes back to the very basics, but like a solid projection model, whether you're signing up for a website or you're making them yourself, that's going to put you, that's going to give you a very good like outline of where to start. I mean, everyone has access to it, but there are still, I kind of like look at the DFS and gambling world or fantasy world as like the Twitter world and then everybody else. And as much as we're in this bubble, the fact of the matter is a huge percentage of people that play fantasy or play DFS aren't using these things that we're using. A lot of people that like, I use my friends as like my anecdotal sample size and they know what I do and they ask me advice and I watch how they build lineups. They open their FanDuel app and they scroll and they plug players in. They don't have a laptop up. They don't have a desktop up. So because of that, you're like starting with good projections and even just a point per dollar model, even though to us that seems like a very rudimentary, elementary part of the game, like that's still the best starting point. That's still how you're going to find really good value. And value is still the name of the game in DFS, no matter if you're playing a 50-50 at the $1 level, or if you're playing head-to-heads all the way up to the $100 level. You're still starting with value. And after that, I mean, all you have to do is go back, look through some of the studies that people like you guys and I have done, and look what drives fantasy scoring. It's volume for certain positions and efficiency for the other. So if I see a running back that's getting volume that hasn't been scoring or hasn't been putting up numbers, that's the guy that I'm going after. Like, it's still, even with all this information out there, the number one driver of ownership or of price is how a player performed last week. So this means there's still inefficiencies in the market. And I'm still looking at these running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, whoever it might be, that are getting the volume or have potential for volume that just haven't been putting up the fantasy points. For quarterbacks, I mean, if there's quarterbacks that have been putting up efficient numbers but just haven't scored a lot of touchdowns, and maybe something like a fantasy point per pass attempt, and they just maybe they're only throwing 20 times a game, but they've been super efficient, that guy's going to pop when it comes into a shootout. So, I mean, it's stuff you can find and hear a lot of places, but a lot of times going back to the basics and not getting cute. Poker DFS, I mean, poker, it's fancy play syndrome. That still exists in DFS.
I love it.
So I guess on top of that, I mean, I didn't hear much in terms of looking at matchups and Vegas lines. I mean, I know you have to consider that, but really if it's like a middling matchup, but you have a guy who's getting, let's just say 20 carries, averaging 18 to 20 carries a game over the last 4, but it just hasn't put it all together.
Yeah.
Do you ignore then maybe not ignore, but do you lessen the matchup for, let's say, a guy who's maybe not getting those amount of touches? Like how do you dictate, like, okay, a guy's getting 12 touches a game at running back, but he's got a fantastic matchup for a guy versus a guy who's got 20 touches, but he's got a far worse matchup.
That 20 touch guy he's still going to be my play by a mile. Like volume is especially if we're talking about running backs specifically, like volume is king. And also, I mean, the nuance of getting down to the micro level of this analysis, we can do 2 hours on this position and this topic. But I mean, where you get to, like, the question is, let's go back to the poker analogy. You hear somebody say, you know what, I got my Jack 9. I hit a straight with my Jack 9 and lost to a full house. And they didn't tell you what stakes they were playing, where they started from, early position, middle position, late position, if it was a raised pot, how the other person has been playing, what the stacks were, what the flop was, all of these things. The same thing translates to DFS. Like, if I'm looking at these two running backs, am I playing a cash game? Am I playing a tournament? How big is the tournament? How big is the field? What stakes am I playing? Is the cash game a head-to-head, 50-50, or double up? All these things are going to factor into the decision point when it comes to player A versus player B. So, I mean, I'm almost always going to default to that 20 touch guy. If those are my only two options, if those are two options I'm looking at, especially in cash games. So I'm almost never going to have that 12 touch guy in cash games, unless it's Danny Woodhead because he's the greatest running back of all time. But I mean, if you're looking at a GPP, if you have 10 lineups, I'm still going to use that 20 touch guy in 7 of them, but I might use that 12 touch guy in 3 of them.
Okay.
Is there some efficacy to the strategy of being pretty close to the field in like 90% of your lineup, and then having that one contrarian play to make you a little bit different, to give you that chance to differentiate your roster and end up at the top?
Yeah, man. All you have to do is look at something like the best way to illustrate these things is to look at the most extreme examples. And the most extreme example we're going to have on the weekly basis is going to be a game like the Millionaire or a qualifier, where it's the most players, the most top-heavy prize, the game where you think you need to be the most contrarian and differentiate yourself most from the field. And if we look at, no matter how big of a data set you look at, whether you just look at 2019 or you look at 2015 to 2019, value is still driving what's winning these tournaments. And you hear contrarian, you think you have to be contrarian across the board. Oftentimes, like the average ownership, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think the winning average lineup had 14% ownership across the board, and usually that was only 1 or 2 guys, with not including defense or quarterback, because the ownership curve there is going to be flatter. But in general, 1 or 2 guys with sub 10% ownership, which we would call low ownership contrarian, and oftentimes 1 or 0 guys below 5%. So yeah, absolutely, we're still looking at value draw is the name of the game. You don't need to be contrarian across the board. And that's why when we're talking about DFS and when we're doing these podcasts in season, we're talking about things like how we're weighting these players in our portfolios, being overweight or underweight. Why a player, if they're only going to be in 1% of lineups overall, you only need them in maybe 10% of your lineups. Like we're playing, we're building a portfolio. We're playing a stock game here. We're looking for inefficiencies, and you don't need to have all of the penny stock. You only need it to hit a couple times.
So what gives Vegas their edge? Do they have more information than us, or are they just interpreting the information differently than the crowd?
Yeah, I mean, are we talking about just like something we would use for DFS, like the lines and the spread and whatnot?
Exactly.
Yes, I mean, look at like whoever you think is the best person for fantasy projections in the game, John Paulson at 444.com, and they have hundreds of those people working in Vegas, working on these games, looking at the same data we're looking at. If any of us with the most minimal Excel skills can download a bunch of game logs, a bunch of data from a site like Pro Football Reference. Look at whatever, let's look at 5-10-year averages, however you want to look at, like whatever you think the most relevant timeline is to today's football. And there's a very tight window of how many points are scored by which type of teams, how many points teams win by, depending on things like obviously the skill level of whatever they think the most position is, quarterback, center, and then coaching staffs, and home away splits, how many points these are worth on their own. And you start to realize that it isn't that crazy that over the long run, or even over the course of the season, that these point totals and point spreads fall to what Vegas can project. It's a lot of math. We have so much data on this game that is a finite game. It isn't baseball. There's only 60 minutes. You can only score so many points. You can only have so many possessions. So it's not surprising. Vegas doesn't have more information than us. They're just using it almost as efficiently as possible, which is why I like DFS, which is why I like poker. I'm not playing against the casino. I'm using the things that the casino uses to make themselves rich to play against other people that aren't using the data effectively.
So would you say half the battle is just identifying what data set is the most important? Like what variables are the most important ones to look at on that given week?
Yeah, I mean, football is really unique in that compared to the other sports from the DFS perspective, where assuming, I mean, there's lots of slates you can play, but let's just assume you're playing the main slate every single week. You have 7 days every week to pour over the data, to second guess your decisions. The information is plentiful. So you can way outthink yourself, out-level yourself, if we're going back to a poker term, and get too deep into the data. So there's definitely a process efficiency that you want to be aware of. And a lot of very good sites and very good writers have outlined it for us, like where these points going to come from. We kind of already talked about it. Touches, opportunity, efficiency. Who's going to be scoring most of those points? Teams that are favored, teams that are at home, teams with high implied point totals. And where might we find some of these things that are surprises? Games that are highly correlated, teams that are facing other teams that pass a lot, teams are going to throw a lot when they're behind. Looking at all these variables, you can start to narrow down your field very quickly. And I think that's half the battle, is just narrowing down that player pool, like you said, looking for an efficient process. So it's definitely a fine line. I mean, I don't have a perfect answer for that. There's not taking enough information, which that's very obvious. But there's also just taking in too much damn information. You have to stop at some point, just build a lineup.
Sam, I know you do a lot of work with start sits, and you've kind of been doing that for the last year or so. No?
No, I said yep.
No, actually,
I actually have a ghostwriter. So.
I've been meaning to talk to you about that.
But yeah, you've been doing a lot of the start sit stuff, and I know for that, like you're looking at DVOAs and you're looking at things that have specific impacts on the single game. So I guess my question for you would be, what other types of information are you taking in that impact your decisions when it comes to looking at, specific games or specific slates or whatever it is that you happen to be looking at that week?
Well, I mean, for me personally, my world might be turned upside down a little bit by TJ here, but I do look at those matchups. I do look at, like you said, DVOA, not only on the defensive side of the ball, but the offensive side of the ball as well. You want to, like for running backs, you want a running back that's going to get a decent amount of touches, that is in an offense that will run the ball more than the average offense and go up against a team that is not good at stopping the run. I know Carolina last year was basically a boon for most running backs. I'm sure there was some wins by people who started Geis against Carolina when he only got 10 touches for 115 yards or something like that against Carolina. So you have to look at that. I do trust Vegas because, like TJ just said, they have hundreds of people looking at these things, looking at all this data. So they have a good way to project these over-unders, and looking at those over-unders, you do have to take them and use that data, but you also have to take them sometimes with a grain of salt, where it's like, okay, well, we've seen all of this data, but I know these injuries are occurring on this side of the defense, or I know these injuries are occurring on this side of the offense, and that over under may be a little bit too high for what you're thinking, or maybe the over under is too low because yes, those two defenses are great, but you're missing two key starters on this side, and that can definitely affect how an offense goes. So those are some things you have to do as well. So I do a lot of the over unders in terms of game per game, and look at like DVOAs on both the offensive side and the defensive side of the ball, and how well they've scored as well, because that's a big one. Like you don't really want a team that's based on, or players that are based on defense and running the ball, because you're just not going to run as many plays as, say, a Tampa Bay who has to play from behind a lot and chuck the ball.
So I think the real world application of everything that we've been talking about right now is to figure out the source of information that gets you the most results. In fantasy specifically, there's so many talking heads out there. There's so much information that's readily available. It's up to you to kind of dig through it and sift through it and figure out what is important, what is going to be the number one variable you focus on, and what the second most important thing that you focus on is, so on and so forth, so that you're able to make informed decisions when looking at things from a season-long perspective. And that'll take us right into the next question. You do season long as well. You do season long best ball. You have a lot of articles on that on 4for4. How do you marry the two? How do you use what you've learned in maybe one side of the coin to make you a better player in the other one?
I mean, I ultimately come from a redraft background. That's my foundation. So best ball is a very natural transition, but there's definitely some nuance to best ball. Probably the most obvious with DFS is that if you are playing in even like kind of high volume, I would call high volume anything over 30 teams in a season. You're building a portfolio like you are in the week for a DFS. It's more of a GPP mindset in best ball, unless you are playing the 2Xs, but most people are either playing like the top three or the winner take all. That's the most popular formats. So you're still looking to build a relatively safe portfolio, or in DFS terms, like the best values on the board. And usually the way I think you're doing that is by having exposure to players like in the early to mid rounds, just based on where their ADPs fall, and letting yourself get the natural exposure based on your multiple draft slots. And then taking your calculated risk, being like really overweight on your 1% plays in DFS, where in best ball that's like your late round plays. So if you have that wide receiver that you're loving in the 18th round, like you can have 90% exposure to that guy, because he's not going to kill you if you don't expect him to do anything anyway. You can still get a lot of other random late round guys. Like you're never going to get equal exposure to the late round guys like you are to the early round guys. So really, I think it's lineup construction, understanding lineup construction, understanding how to build a profitable portfolio, and then to a lesser extent, game selection. The game selection thing in best ball is kind of tough. There just aren't that many options. I think probably just most intuitively, like if you see bigger tournaments, like not throwing all of your bankroll into those, it's just going to be harder to win. Like even if you don't want to play the 2Xs, just favoring games like the top three instead of the winner take all format.
I want to touch on lineup construction because I think that's something that definitely sits in both worlds, especially even going as far as to go into Dynasty. It's important to have an idea of how you want to build your team and what position groups you want to stock more heavily than others for whatever reason that you're choosing. Like for me, if I, for example, get like a Travis Kelce or a Mark Andrews or something like that, I know I'm really not going to have to worry about tight end all that much. So I don't need to spend very many other roster spots on tight end. But if you happen to have, a guy like a Blake Jarwin that you're rolling with, that you're hoping can pop, but you're not necessarily sure that's going to happen, having an idea of what your ideal roster construction is going to give you an edge when it comes to just being able to be in a decent position when people get injured or things happen and whatnot. So I just kind of wanted to ask you. Now, I don't know much about best ball tournaments as well, but I mean, is there like a principles that you live by? Is there a rule to live by when it comes to looking at an optimal lineup?
In terms of lineup construction?
Yes, in terms of how many of QBs or running backs or tight ends or whatever it is that you need to have on said roster.
Yeah, the one thing we want to do is look at win rates, and I mean this is going to vary a lot depending on the platform you're playing on, because some of these platforms have defenses, some don't. If you're playing traditional FFPC, you're looking at like 28-man rosters versus 18 or 20-man rosters. So obviously those 28-man rosters, you're really just going to max out all of your positions, like 3 quarterbacks, 3 defenses, 3 tight ends. Just makes sense. But if we look at something like a Yahoo or like a draft from last year, or like a best ball 10, those are much bigger decision points. The 1C positions are probably the biggest decision points for people: when to spend the draft capital, how many to choose. And a lot of times it comes down to, are you going to have 2 or 3 quarterbacks, 2 or 3 tight ends, 2 or 3 defenses? I think probably the most obvious thing that we've seen is going the 3-3-3 approach. At those is very unprofitable. Most of these games are flex. You end up taking away the ability to not be able to maximize that flex opportunity, not be able to maximize those winners at those league winners at other positions, usually running back and wide receiver. So traditionally, we're looking at not using 3 at all 3 of those positions. Over the course of like the best ball kind of come up over the past few years, we've seen that 2 quarterback has been the most profitable over all leagues. But one of the smartest guys in best ball, Sean Siegel, has pointed out that if you're cramming in a 3 quarterback lineup into a certain draft range, a lot of times that can work. So not taking an early quarterback, but taking like 3 quarterbacks in the middle round. And then I think probably the biggest edge or thing people are overlooking is they don't want to spend 3 out of 18 draft spots at defense, but 3 defenses has just shown to be like, your defense is scoring points every week, and I know you only get to start 1, but you're never going to waste. In best ball, one of the biggest risks, and the one reason people could get very conservative is oftentimes we're drafting months in advance. There's no trades, there's no waiver wires, so you run the risk of taking a 0 from a spot across the board. Everybody does. You're probably going to end up with multiple of those. Your defense is never going to give you a 0. You're always going to have a chance to have like that 20-point defense every week, where you might have 4 or 5 running backs, wide receivers, maybe your quarterback, that's just 0 across your roster on the board. So I think taking 3 defenses, probably one of the biggest edges. And then, like you said, I mean, we can't cover it all in this time frame, but I think usually you're looking around that 5 to 6 running backs, 7 to 8 wide receivers, depending on the size of the roster. But anything more or less than that on either end, you're just kind of wasting rosters.
Damn. All right. Yep. I just wrote notes, ladies and
gentlemen. There's deeper reads, man. It's hard to cover all the nuance. Obviously, at 4for4, we have a ton of stuff, but I mean, RotoViz and then some of the guys at Roto Grinders like Hornsby, between Mike Beers and Josh Hornsby, Josh ADHD. I mean, there's so much, and of course 4for4. There's so much good best ball data that's just going to give you a really good foundation on these things.
Oh yeah. We had Josh on the show last year, I believe, and he went over some of that stuff for us as well. So definitely respect him and community as well. So let's talk about specific players for a moment. Let's talk about the meat and potatoes of this show, the podcast. Yeah. So is there a guy, or is there a team, or is there a coaching staff, a situation that you're just not fucking with? And then, of course, put this in the context of everyone listening. Everything is going to be fucked up in a minute with the rookie draft. This is going to change everything that's said on this podcast, so take this with a grain of salt. But for right now, from the data you've seen and you're able to parse, who is on the do not fuck with list?
Yeah, usually when I'm looking at this, it's like, who's the dumpster fire offense? But I was kind of going through all of those this year, and like even the worst dumpster fires or potential dumpster fires have like one or two guys that I kind of like. But then the next question is like, okay, like who's like price or like regression? And I think probably the worst team to invest in right now is the Titans. I just don't see myself having any Titans. Ryan Tannehill played out of his mind at an unsustainable rate. They have a running back that doesn't catch the ball that's highly that his touchdowns, a lot of them are falling from the 1 yard line. He does have some long runs, especially down the stretch of last season. But if we look over his career and even like the first half of last year, a lot of those are 1 yard touchdowns, and that's very dependent on that offense being highly efficient. AJ Brown was one of the best rookies last year. Now all of a sudden, he's also going to be a guy that's going to have to deal with a quarterback that's going to regress heavily. So I just see an offense with a quarterback who we're expecting him to repeat an historical year of a quarterback that's never been that great to begin with, a running back that doesn't fit the profile of someone that I want to invest heavily in, that you're going to have to spend like a top 7 or 8 pick on, and he's going to be extremely game dependent. We don't have to worry about that because the offense was so damn good last year, and a receiver on a team that relied heavily on efficiency last year, but they're still just not going to be an air it out. They're not going to be a Kansas City Chiefs, a Tampa Bay Buccaneers, not Tampa Bay anymore, but Tampa Bay from last year. So I don't see a player on the Titans that I even want on my roster.
That was a fire take, everybody. And it's a brilliant take at that because, regression's a thing. We talk about it all the time on this podcast. Regression is a thing, and you have to be wary of those regressions. For instance, a guy that I probably am avoiding this year is Aaron Jones because of the 13 touchdowns, something like that, rushing touchdowns, and many of them within
19 total,
and many of them with inside the 5 yard line. You have Jamal Williams there, who likely is going to garner little touches again. It's going to be tough for him to regress or to continue to produce those double-digit touchdowns. 19 touchdowns in this day and age is huge. So that's a guy that I'm probably trying to avoid a little bit here.
And let me just say one more thing. The difference with the Titans, last year it was Patrick Mahomes with the caveat he could still be the QB1, but not with that much of a gap because he has Travis Kelce, because he has Andy Reid, because he has Tyreek Hill. With Lamar Jackson, he's going to regress, but he could still be the QB1 because of his legs, because he was very efficient, because he has Mark Andrews, because he's going to rush for 1,000 yards. With the Titans, you don't have that caveat. You don't have Ryan Tannehill is still going to be the most efficient passer in the league, but he could still be the QB2. No, Ryan Tannehill is going to regress, and he could be like the QB 18. Like, he's not Patrick Mahomes. He's not Lamar Jackson. He's not Peyton Manning. He's none of these guys. He can regress to like a very, very ugly like situation with a coach that wants to run the ball on a team that is in a suddenly like kind of good and scary division.
And I would add to that Tennessee had a below, I guess, average situation neutral pace. So the amount of volume from the plays that they're even going to be able to put on the field is not going to get you to the promised land. It's not going to make up for any lapse in efficiency. And what you were talking about is the efficiency is more likely to come down. So if that's the case, you need something to offset that, and that doesn't exist in that Titans offense as currently constructed.
Yeah, man, and like probably the biggest point of contention, I think everybody would agree that Tannehill's going to regress, and no one's like his ADP shows like people are still not like people aren't taking him as a QB5 or something like that, but it's going to be Derrick Henry. But this team could be in some like really bad game scripts. This team could legit finish in third place in this division. I know people like to shit on Bill O'Brien or whatever. They still have Deshaun Watson. They still have Will Fuller if he stays healthy. They got David Johnson, who's a wild card. And now they got Brandon Cooks. Like, this is a team that's still going to be able to score with anybody. So with that, you're going to be able to win some games. And the Colts are like a really sneaky team with Phillip Rivers. I know people think Phillip Rivers is washed, but I think Phillip Rivers can do some things with T.Y. Hilton. And then all of a sudden, I think he makes like Nyheim Hines an interesting play and a good 1-2 combo with him and Marlon Mack. Him and Frank Reich have a history together. That's like, I think Ian Hartnett's like tweeted out, are Colts actually the team that we want Tampa Bay 2020 to be? And that's like an exact sentiment. Like, Colts are like the sneaky AFC team. So, Titans could be in trouble this year. They could be like a 6-10 or 7-9 team.
So this pains me to say, but I have pretty heavily invested in AJ Brown in a couple of my startup drafts. I hope, you know what? I don't hope. I'm confident that because of what we've seen from his yards per route run last season and some of the other somewhat predictive metrics that you kind of have out there, that over the long haul, that maybe there's some hope from him. But this season,
AJ Brown's a dog. AJ Brown's a dog. I mean, you like that's the position where you just go like talent. If you're an alpha, you're the dude, and I think he's that. I think 2020 can be a little bit ugly. Like AJ Brown can have he can easily have like a 70 catch, 1,100 yard, 2 touchdown season.
All right, so who's the team or player that can get it? That can get it if they want it for the 2020 season?
I mean, I haven't been crazy loading up on any team. This is going to be really contingent on if what I think happens, and it kind of probably leads into one of the other questions. But if the Chargers decide to not roll a Tyrod Taylor, that could be a team that is like a really nice team to stack. A healthy Hunter Henry. Obviously, Keenan Allen's one of the best possession receivers in the league. Austin Eckler, him as an RB1. I hope they sign Cam so bad, and I think they're gonna. That team is going to be so damn fun. Kansas City, they're the team in the AFC West, but from a fantasy perspective, their defense puts up points. Their defense is still garbage. Raiders have one of the worst defenses in the league. Denver is whatever. Their team's bad. Their defense is okay.
Hold on, you better watch yourself, TJ. You're talking to 2 Broncos fans here.
Hey man, you guys are coming in last place in the division, but
Chargers
are a team that could be fun, man.
Look at your San Diego bias showing. Come on, get that out of here.
I don't even like the Chargers like that. I grew up a Raiders fan. I don't even like them
anymore. You just hate the Broncos, as we know.
No, I'm DFS has ruined all of my caring about wins.
Fair enough.
I definitely do see that sentiment. I think the Chargers were sneaky. I was hoping Jameis Winston went to the Chargers. I thought that with the weapons on that team that he'd be a good addition. But if it's Cam, if it's Winston, as long as it's not Tyrod, I think there's a lot of value still that's left uncovered there.
Yeah, I wanted to say the Cardinals, but that's like the easy one right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Now, I guess we can go in a little bit further to the Cardinals. Some people are kind of scared off of DeAndre Hopkins, though. They're saying that the target volume is going to be there. We're definitely people that have kind of said that just because, he was pretty much the main man in Houston. Like, Will Fuller was not healthy enough to be a true number 2 in that offense for long stretches. And so it was DeAndre Hopkins versus the world. Now it's DeAndre Hopkins, it's Larry Fitzgerald, it's Christian Kirk. Obviously, Kyler Murray has a little bit to do with his legs as well. So, is there maybe some of a downtick from D-Hop this year?
This is an offense that's going to roll out 4 wide receivers. This offense that jumped from one of the worst efficiency, or the worst teams in terms of efficiency and scoring 2 years ago to the middle of the pack with a rookie quarterback and a rookie head coach. And they threw 550 times last year, which was middle of the pack. Like, if that bumps up to like 600-ish, which isn't even like that high, I think that would put them in the top like 12 or something. So only like the top third of the league. DeAndre Hopkins could drop down to like 26% target share, which is low for him, and still hit his like 140 or 150 targets. So I think people are just kind of like looking at Fitz and Kirk and DeAndre Hopkins and like just going kind of with the lazy, it's crowded narrative. But like he's one of those. There's not that many DeAndre Hopkins in the league. There's only 3 or 4 guys that can handle that kind of volume, and that kind of volume very rarely goes away. Like I think he's still 150 target guy kind of easily.
Do you think we see an uptick from what we saw last year in an offense that maybe may be a little bit more voluminous for him, or do you think it's kind of more of the same?
No, I think that 150 number where he was at last year is kind of like it's still going to put him in, what was he, 3rd in targets last year, I think, behind Michael Thomas and Julio. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, maybe tied for 4th. But that's still going to put him in top 5 volume. Like, what else do you want? That's fine for me. We talked about it a little bit earlier. Volume is king, and this is a team that, this team could easily be the top scoring team in the league this year.
Does this spell death for Christian Kirk? And
No,
what does Kenyon
opposite.
Drake mean to you?
Opposite, bro. This is like Christian Kirk is. If we look at like what this team does, like I said, they're going to roll out 4 wide receivers. DeAndre Hopkins is a player that has always lined up. He lines up every position on the field. If we look at his targets last year, it was almost even distribution, left side, right side, and in the slot on either side. Larry Fitzgerald isn't going to move from the slot. Christian Kirk can play on the slot or on the outside. As much as people look at their 4 wide receiver sets, their primary set was still 3 wide receivers. They had way more 3 wide receiver sets than 4 wide receiver sets last year. So their primary lineup is going to be Fitz in the slot, Hopkins on one side, Christian Kirk on the outside. Those 2 outside receivers in offense like that, those dudes are going to eat. If we're looking for Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin this year, it's Hopkins and Christian Kirk. Like Christian Kirk can easily do what Godwin did last year. Godwin only had 119 targets. Like there's no reason Christian Kirk, he played 3 less games than Fitz last year, and they had the same number of targets. He was on pace for like 130 targets or something like that. He can hit 125, 130 targets and have a Godwin season this year with Larry Fitzgerald still getting his 90 targets.
I just wanted to add a couple players here that I think are getting a lot of disrespect in ADP right now, at the very least. Tyler Boyd and Robert Woods, Robert Woods' ADP should probably jump after the Cooks trade, but regardless, Robert Woods was wide receiver 11, 2018, was that right? And then wide receiver 14 in 2019. Boyd was wide receiver 14 and then wide receiver 17 in the past 2 seasons. And they're going, Boyd's going wide receiver 25 right now. Robert Woods is going wide receiver 31. And I just don't know. You have 2 guys there who can finish top 16 wide receivers. You're getting a ton of value there, and they're actually relatively consistent as well. So maybe not the best late round receivers for best fall just in terms of consistency, but consistency is king, I believe, in fantasy football. And if you can get those 2, and the way and mind you, this is startup for dynasty stuff, but the way I approach things is I usually grab one of those guys as my wide receiver one. I build up my running backs, and I feel pretty comfortable. Even if they are wide receiver 2s, it's probably still top 18 for both of them.
Yeah, if you're not buying Woods and Cooper Kupp right now, I think you're probably crazy. They were both top 11 in targets last year. That was with Brandon Cooks on the roster. I don't like those guys should at least match their target numbers this year. Tyler Boyd, I'm probably a little bit cooler on him just because AJ Green should be healthy, and it's hard not to upgrade from Andy Dalton, but Joe Burrow's still going to be a rookie. So if we're talking 2020, there's a little bit of risk there with Boyd, but he had 3 or 4 fewer targets than DeAndre Hopkins, who we were just talking about. So even if he drops down to 125, that's still a lot of targets.
Right. There's room for him to be more efficient too.
Well, and AJ Green, even with AJ Green, I think he did better in 2018 with AJ Green on the field than without. So I think the rookie QB thing is definitely something of a bit of a risk. But when you actually look at what happened last year and the fact that he got 47 targets, and I can't believe that it can be any worse than it was last year for Boyd. Then that's the point where it's like, okay, maybe he's not as much of a risk as a lot of people think with the return. And probably likely a better offense with the return of AJ Green with Mixon and a better QB. Maybe he gets, like you said, 120, 125 targets, but they're better and more efficient targets.
Yeah, this probably won't end up mattering, but it might even just help the offense be more efficient as a whole. But John Ross was playing really good before he got hurt. I think people are really forgetting that. I don't even think he's being drafted right now, and he's probably not a player that's going to be. It's going to be hard to perform with Tyler Boyd and Green and Mixon. That's just another weapon on the field. They could be a sneaky. I don't know if it's sneaky. I think people are kind of getting excited about them, but they could be a really good offense.
Yeah, I agree. They really remind me somewhat of the 2018 Rams. That they should play a lot of I think they should play a lot of 11 personnel. They don't really have that tight end that they can rely on. So I think you're going to see a lot of 11 personnel with those 3 wide receivers starting on the outside and slot there.
Yeah, I made a joke last year on Twitter. I think it said I feel like Zach Taylor read Twitter and he's applying it really badly. Like he just threw a lot, but he didn't do a good job.
Yeah, right.
But even if he keeps doing it, that just means a lot of targets for the guys.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Now, is there a certain weight that you put to offensive lines? Because, I mean, the one commonality between all three teams that we did talk about is they do have significant offensive line issues going into the season.
Mm-hmm.
Do we think that that's going to hamper what these offenses can do? Do we think that, that is going to be enough to maybe just get you a tad lower on any of these players? Or is this something that you think kind of just comes out in the wash?
I don't think it's a wash. Offensive line play is probably one of my leaks. Like the spot that I probably use offensive line play the most efficiently is looking for defenses to target that are going to be like in a positive game script scenario. I think people probably misapply it the most when it comes to quarterbacks, like sacks. I think like the sacks are a quarterback stat is probably an argument that people could go back and forth on, but like it's the statuesque quarterback versus the Russian quarterback, but not even just that, the quarterback who can get rid of the ball and make the quick decision. So like Peyton Manning and Tom Brady, how do they coincidentally always have the best offensive lines in the league? They don't. They know how to not take sacks. But a mobile quarterback, they're not going to mask a bad offensive line. They're actually gonna mobile quarterbacks and take a lot more sacks. But I think what people misinterpret is like a mobile quarterback, even if their offensive line is kind of bad, they're gonna open up some more lanes for their running back. So like if we're talking about like a Christian Kirk, he's still behind a mediocre offensive. I'm sorry, not Christian Kirk, Kyler Murray, still behind a bad offensive line, but going to help out his running back because it just kind of puts the defense on their heels a little bit. So I think that's where people misinterpret the offensive line thing. It's a factor. I think it's probably more of a tiebreaker than a decision maker for me.
One of the trends that I've been looking at the last few seasons has been the devaluation of true wide receiver ones. There aren't many true wide receiver ones still left in the NFL. And I mean, these guys aren't getting the same level of targets and the same level of market share that they did just 5 years ago. You can see that it's borne out in the data pretty quickly and pretty easily. I wanted to ask you, is there a trend or something that you saw last year or, just anything that you think that maybe not everyone has fully caught up to that you think that will give you a little bit of an edge going into the 2020 season?
Just in relation to that recent phenomenon, you mean, of the wide receiver?
In relation to that, in relation to something else you might have observed, just like, is there something that you think isn't mainstream and probably should be?
I think probably there are a lot of factors to this. I think we had that like 2014 wide receiver class that was phenomenal, that kind of coincided with just there being a lot of really good wide receivers in the league. If you remove one or two of those guys, it really takes those numbers and drops them really quickly. When you remove an Antonio Brown from a player pool and when a Devontae Adams gets hurt for a portion of the season, those numbers drop quickly. There aren't that many unicorn wide receivers at the same time. We've kind of seen this recent resurgence of these top tier running backs. So they're going to overtake the wide receivers in terms of these points scored. And teams are just using running backs more in the passing game. I think teams are just realizing that's a really efficient way to use your team. So that's just naturally going to bring, like, if I'm interpreting the data right, I think we're just seeing all these target and touchdown shares just converging. The wide receiver 2 is getting closer to the wide receiver 1. The running back is getting closer to the wide receiver 1 and 2 in terms of targets. Tight end not so much because it's a dumpster fire, but if a decent tight end, he's going to eat into that. So I think probably just people underestimating the value of these pass catching RB2s and these like mid-tier wide receivers. These mid-tier wide receivers all of a sudden have as much upside as their counterparts. And I think you see that like a Calvin Ridley, all of a sudden he doesn't see the volume as Julio, but all of a sudden it feels like he has as much upside as him. A Kenny Golladay is like in a wide receiver 1 talk, but he isn't like that alpha Antonio Brown that we saw a couple years ago. So I think it's probably just people not valuing it. It's probably way more obvious from a DFS perspective because you can look at GPPs and like how these winning lineups are shaking out and those pass catching running backs. But really, those like mid-tier wide receivers have a lot of value, and I don't think people are realizing how much the wide receiver two on the team, how much value that player has right now.
Do you think running back involvement is the new norm, or do you think because of the inefficiency of actually giving a running back this many targets that eventually the pendulum starts to swing again the other way?
I don't know, man. It's hard to say when you have like a Saquon and a Christian McCaffrey at the same time in the league. I think people are looking for that, and it's just not widely available. And like to have that guy in your team, you're like from a team building real life NFL perspective, like you're just gonna have to like build a very inefficient offense and spend a lot of draft capital on a player like Christian McCaffrey or Saquon Barkley. So I think probably it's more like the running back by committee is what teams are going to be trending towards, but we still see the Saquon and the Christian McCaffrey. So those guys are going to stand out in our minds. But like from a fantasy perspective, there's just going to be a lot of value in those running backs that they're not workhorses, but if they're getting 60% snap share and they're involved in the pass game, like I think those are like that's where the inefficiency is right now in fantasy.
Is there an RB2 on a team, Stoppy, that you think should probably be getting more recognition than he is right now?
I mean, in my circles, he's getting a lot of recognition, but I think Boston Scott is one. Had 26 targets in his last 4 games last season. I think Miles Sanders is going to be the workhorse there, but I think Boston Scott will get his touches, and he was pretty electric coming out of college. He just wasn't well known because he went to Louisiana Tech. Is that right? I can't remember now. I think it was Louisiana Tech.
I'll look it up, God.
But yeah, I mean, and we know Doug Peterson does the committee approach. Well, it may not be that big of a committee this time around, but we saw Jordan Howard and Boston Scott be successful while Miles Sanders was breaking out in his rookie season. So Boston Scott could get 50 plus targets next season easily, and he's going way late. Another one, I like Justin Jackson. I don't think that Eckler is going to get the Melvin Gordon workload per se. I do think he will get more touches. And I could see him approaching 180 carries, 80 plus targets, but that leaves a lot of room for Justin Jackson in terms of carries. And we saw him in his first 4 weeks last year. He was a pretty efficient runner. And then when he had to play his rookie season as well, when both Eckler and Gordon were banged up, he showed some flashes then too. And he was a guy coming out of college that had a lot of success in college. I think 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons. There were multiple 20-plus reception seasons. So, I mean, that's another guy that I think will give you some touches. I mean, even if he's your only your like RB4 or 5, he could have a nice floor for you just getting touches. And then finally, I think this Melvin Gordon news has definitely lowered Philip Lindsay's value significantly, but I think it might actually end up being a good thing for Philip Lindsay's efficiency. We saw him struggle towards the end of last season. We saw him struggle towards the end of his rookie season as well. If he's not getting that many touches or as many touches, he's not expected to be a workload. He's a 2-time Pro Bowl back to start his career, and he could be efficient with those touches and still if it's a 60-40 split, you're looking at some really good numbers. Even if it's 70-30, I still think that you will have some of those games that are perfect for best ball.
If everybody that lives in Denver could trade in their John Elway jersey for a Philip Lindsay jersey, would they do it?
Woo! They might. They love Philip Lindsay, baby.
I'd have to think about it. I would really have to think about it. And that pains me, man, because I love John Elway. But what have you done to this team? So same question to you, TJ. Is there an RB2 on a team that maybe just isn't getting the recognition that they deserve?
Yeah, we wanted as a fantasy community, we were like, Chase Edmonds is the dude that's going to overtake David Johnson. They signed Kenyon Drake. Kenyon Drake was amazing. It was a small sample, and like he had a 4 touchdown game. So those numbers are really skewed. Chase Edmonds, I think, is still going to be in the mix on what could end up being the best offense in the league. I think Chase Edmonds could easily see 150 touches this year, even with Kenyon Drake doing his thing. And Kenyon Drake hasn't done it over a full season, so who knows what happens there. Another one is Rashad Penny. He's a player like on a team that's going to be the most run heavy in the league, with the most run heavy coordinator in the league with Schottenheimer. And this was a guy when they were both healthy, we were talking about as a team that can have two running backs that are getting 15 touches. And I think even if Chris Carson, kind of similar situation, if even Chris Carson like pays off what he's going at his asking price, Rashad Penny is a running back they spent first round draft capital on that can see 150 to 200 touches in this offense.
So you don't think Pete Carroll is going to break Mina Kimes's and all the rest of the Seahawk fans out there again by drafting A.J. Dillon in the second or third round?
If they draft another early round running back, dude, just let Russell Wilson be Russell Wilson, bro.
You have to. You absolutely have to. All right, final question before we get into this week's Dynasty Diagnostic. Overcorrection is a thing. Obviously, there's so much data available to all of us that, overanalyzation gets to the point where you start to give more weight to maybe things that probably should be a factor, but maybe not to the degree that you think that it should be. Is there a guy that has seen his value tank or has seen his value drop off significantly during this offseason that you think is unwarranted?
I don't know. It's probably not unwarranted in terms of what happened last year, but I think it's definitely an overcorrection. Juju Smith-Schuster was going as a first-round pick last year, and now he's going as like a third-round pick as the wide receiver. I don't even know if he's going in the top 12 at this point. He was banged up. He didn't have Ben Roethlisberger. It was a team that just like nothing that we wanted to happen happened for that team. Ben Roethlisberger's coming back. Juju's 1 season removed from being a top 8 fantasy receiver. Obviously, had Antonio Brown protecting him, but I still think Juju he's a player that popped at a very young age. He's still very young, and he's going to be the wide receiver 1 for Ben Roethlisberger. And say what you will about Roethlisberger or his age, I think he's going too late for what he can be in this offense right now. I think Juju is probably like my favorite buy or like post-hype sleeper right now.
I would have said this before yesterday. I'm still saying it today, but it's Brandon Cooks.
Yeah.
He's before the trade yesterday. He was a wide receiver 47 in DLF ADP. He had 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons with 3 different quarterbacks. And yes, 2 of them are Hall of Fame quarterbacks. One of them is Jared Goff, who actually is actually a decent quarterback in my mind. Now he's going to Deshaun Watson, so his value should creep back up, especially because, I don't think there's any doubt, at least in my mind, that he's the wide receiver 1 for Deshaun Watson. There is some concern with Will Fuller and Brandon Cooks crossing over in terms of skill sets, but a lot of people will point out, well, he's had concussions, but he's only missed 2 games since his rookie season. He played 4 straight seasons of 16 games, only missed 2 last year. I get it. Concussions are rough in terms of predicting their time out, and they get worse as you get more. But Devontae Adams had concussion issues, and I don't think anybody's really concerned about him anymore.
I think one thing with Brandon Cooks and the concussions is they happened in high-profile moments. They happened in playoff games. They happened when everybody was watching. So I think that has a lot to do with the perception of his concussions being more of an issue than Devontae Adams.
And let's be real. The Rams' offense last year shifted a lot. I think they played in like 92% 11 personnel in 2018, and that dropped significantly last year, especially in the second half of the season. And Brandon Cooks produced with Cooper Kupp, with Robert Woods there, with Todd Gurley, somewhat in his prime. He still had the knee issues, but somewhat in his prime. So Brandon Cooks dropping that far, especially because he's still relatively young. He's still 27, I think. Still got some good years ahead of him. And I don't think that was warranted after one down season. And then now and those who took a shot on him are getting rewarded at this point because he's now in an offense that he's the wide receiver one with a great quarterback who throws deep.
As you guys were talking, I took Brandon Cooks in the 9th round over best ball and put Boston Scott on my auto draft.
Love it. Love it.
There we go.
Sometimes we know what we're talking about. The big names will start listening to us, maybe.
Maybe. We already talked to Graham Barfield, so all we need to do is just get to 10,000 shows. So as long as we can do that, I think eventually we might get there. I totally lied, completely lied. That was not the last question. There was one more question to be had there. One of the guys that I subscribe to, that I listen to, is Jim Quick. He's a guy that is a memory expert. He's a learning expert. And one of the things that he kind of pushes out to his audience, one of the ideals and theories that he pushes out to his audience, that knowledge and being deliberate about something is a force multiplier. It allows you to take the information that is important to you and that is relevant to you and add that, I guess, extra little, I don't even know how to say this, but that extra little motivation to go ahead and to get that particular thing done, or to memorize that person's name, or so on and so forth. There's so much information, again, out there that you have to be very careful in parsing out what is and isn't important. So what is your force multiplier? What types of things have you found in the fantasy game that you constantly cite and that you've kind of made one of your principles in looking at any type of format?
I mean, if we're talking about straight like DFS analysis or just fantasy analysis, I'm not blowing smoke because this is like my legit friend at this point, but a lot of my foundation comes from Bale's articles and Jonathan Bale's books. Like even though if you look at some of the examples from DraftKings, like the exact point models and whatnot, they might be a little outdated, but if you're going to learn how to be contrarian thinker and be someone that can be creative in any realm, whether it be fantasy or some other like art form or passion, then you still need to have like a solid foundation. And his books were the foundation for DFS. Like they lay out so many of these concepts that all of us talk about like they're second nature. But I still reference some of his books, reference his articles, still like have these ideas in my subconscious that I go back and look for. And beyond Bale's books, probably one of the most valuable things he always did, and I don't think a lot of people followed up on. The only person I know for sure that's followed up on this is Chris Raybon. At the end of Bale's blogs or books, he always linked to his like book club, so to speak. And a lot of these books, like the Nassim Taleb books, are the most obvious ones, most popular ones, the Anti-Fragile Idea. But just a lot of these books on how to be contrarian, how to like think logically, how to think through problems, be a critical thinker. Those books translate to anything that you're doing in life. And I've luckily taken the time and stumbled into some of those suggested books that Bales has recommended to me. And you find yourself just kind of like naturally thinking differently than people do when these problems come up. So, I mean, I owe a ton to Jonathan. He's recommended me to people. He's been somebody that's kind of built me up in the industry, but even stuff that I've never shared with him personally, just kind of following him from afar. I mean, you could go, he doesn't write much anymore, and he's kind of removed himself from the content side of fantasy, but you can still find all of his books and just his blogs and articles. There's a lot of good stuff you can get from that dude. He's the Tim Ferriss of fantasy football, basically.
I guess there's two people that I've cited in a ton of my work, and it's Rich Rebar and the Konami Code. That has helped me pick out guys to make that leap, that second-year quarterback leap. Patrick Mahomes was my quote-unquote tout for 2018, and then last year it was Lamar Jackson. To the point where I offended a lot of Baker Mayfield fans. through the process.
Correctly.
Yeah. And I wrote an article last year about Dak being in the top 5 as well. And all of that is centered around, and it's helped me with like my quarterback picks as well. But it's centered around that Konami code and understanding that running quarterbacks, regardless of how well they are or how good they are as a quarterback, they will get you fantasy points given the opportunity. So that's why like guys like Jalen Hurts are on my radar this year, because I think he's being severely underrated. I think he's a better passer than people make him out to be. But the fact that he can run a sub 4.6 40 at and he has over 1,000 yards in college and nearly 1,000 yards in 2 seasons tells me that he can make an impact right away. We saw Lamar Jackson in 2018 make an impact right away. I don't think they make the playoffs if they don't have Lamar Jackson in there ahead of Joe Flacco. And he didn't throw all that much. And he had things to improve, but the fact that he was a runner helped him tremendously and helped the Ravens tremendously. Tim Tebow's probably should be like the poster boy for Konami code. That, and Eitan and I know we're Broncos fans. Watching that season was just a roller coaster of emotion, because the first 3 quarters we were losing our goddamn minds, screaming from the rooftops, and then all of a sudden
Demarius Thomas takes it to the end zone.
Yeah. And then in the fourth quarter, he turns on this Tebow magic and makes these plays. And he was actually a solid fantasy asset as well that season, because he had a floor of like 15 points, despite the fact that he couldn't throw the ball for his life. He had a 2-for-7 game that year and still gave you double-digit fantasy points. That just tells you how valuable running the ball is. And so I respect Rich Rebar for breaking that open and kind of putting everybody's attention on that. And I've used that a ton. And then Matt Waldman for me is kind of my film guru I mean, I can look at film and do decent film analysis, but nothing like what Matt Waldman does for the rookie scouting portfolio. He helps me understand rookies inside and out, helps me understand what film analysts are talking about with like, pinpoint accuracy versus general accuracy. And you wouldn't know, I mean, if you didn't know any better, you wouldn't know the difference there. Or things like the difference between visions and stuff like that, and what you're looking at and how they move their hips and stuff like that. And he's helped me tremendously in terms of evaluating rookies and who I should be picking in those rookie drafts. So those are like my 2 guys that I go to for a lot of my analysis.
Yeah, JJ Zacharyson, Chris Raybon, definitely huge influences for me. I've recently started to get into some of Jonathan Bales' stuff as well, which is why I even brought up his name when we started this podcast. Dude, genius doesn't describe it. Honestly, there's just so much that you can learn. So that's definitely kind of my Mount Rushmore of guys that I'm looking to when I'm looking to do things. And I think another guy that maybe not a lot of people won't necessarily like, but that I think is very, very wise in the way that he does podcasts and what I try to do and making the show as interesting or as uninteresting as it might be is Matt Kelly. I think he's really good at the podcast game as well. And I've not necessarily modeled how I podcast off of that, but I've looked at the things that he does and little tips and tricks that he does to make things interesting and try to incorporate that into this show as well. So let's look at this roster. Let's plug in the analyzer and get to this week's Dynasty Diagnostic. It is a 12-team Superflex point per reception Dynasty League, quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end, a flex, and a super flex. And for the purposes of this, we're going to assume that this is a season-long scenario. We want to win with this team right now. So what types of things, what types of moves do we need to do to be able to achieve that goal? So let's look at quarterbacks. Kyler Murray, Matt Ryan, Matthew Stafford, Mitchell Trubisky, Josh Rosen, Andrew Luck still on the roster? I guess so. If you have some,
you never know. He might come back in a year.
If you have some idea or if you have some inside information, please tell me so I can bet on that now. But I mean, I really don't know how long we even need to spend on this. Kyler Murray, QB1, Matt Ryan, QB2, Matthew Stafford, probably even better than Matt Ryan, QB2. So You're fine at quarterback here. Is there anything anyone's doing to change this around, switch this around? Do you need to trade one of these guys potentially for help somewhere else?
Why trade him? You got you're going to be at top of every bye week in your league.
Yeah, I mean, and you have. I mean, do you really, Aton? This is mainly to you. Do you really want to trust Trubisky as a bye week fill-in?
Absolutely not.
Okay, so you have 3 potential QB1s, and in best ball, I mean, you get the top 2 scores out of that. So that's fantastic.
All right, tight ends: Evan Ingram, Dallas Goedert, Dawson Knox. I don't want to talk about Evan Ingram. Everybody knows he's a stud if you can be on the field. Dallas Goedert, I think, is in the same range, if not better long-term than Zach Ertz is. I want to talk about Dawson Knox. Does anybody think that Dawson Knox can be something this year or into the future?
We have had an argument about Stephon Diggs for weeks now, and the volume isn't there for 3 or 4 people. I mean, I still think Cole Beasley's going to get targets. I still think John Brown's going to get targets. Obviously, Stephon Diggs is going to get targets. And then you have to throw in guys like Singletary will get some targets. Another wide receiver, is Robert Foster still there? Or did he go to Pittsburgh?
I'm honestly not even sure.
But it doesn't matter. I mean, You'll have those miscellaneous wide receivers that, let's just say, combine for 50 targets. And then you have Dawson. I mean, I just don't. And then Tyler Kroft is there as well. So I just don't know where you're going to get the targets where he becomes a quote unquote thing. Now in best ball, he might be fine. He could have a blow up week or 2 there. But I mean, I wouldn't believe in Dawson Knox at this point.
Yeah, I think even in best ball, you're just like wasting a roster spot if you're taking like a tight end 25. Like you probably want like your tight end 3 to be like a top 18 tight end if you're even dealing with 3 tight ends on your team. I mean, it's exactly what you said. Like Josh Allen is going to take so much of the like equity out of his team because he's going to rush. He's going to steal rushing touchdowns, and like they're still probably not going to be a high passing volume team. And then everything else that Steve says just doesn't even, I don't know where it comes from. Like I think probably Diggs and John Brown are going to do better together than people think, but there's just not a lot meat left on the bone. And Devin Singletary is going to be a top 6 fantasy running back in 2020.
Oh, I like how you dropped that.
I like that. And here you go. TJ Hernandez just going like contrarian here. Oh, they're going to get somebody else. And TJ's like, nah, bro. Top 6.
Devin Singletary for the win.
I'll tell you what, I traded Todd Gurley straight up for Devin Singletary, and I really like what you just told me.
They were giving Singletary so much work the last like 5 weeks of the season.
They were. Oh my God.
Yeah, Devin Singletary and Miles Sanders definitely the guys to own that could be in line for increased work this season. So let's go to running backs. Let's take that put in segue there. Saquon Barkley, he's decent. I've heard of him. I think he's an all right player. Joe Mixon, Marlon Mack. We talked about Rashad Penny, so that's an interesting addition to this team. Lamar Miller. I don't know if he's still around. I don't know if he's still in the league. I don't know if his legs still work after what happened last year. Raquel Armstead. Leonard Fournette didn't get hurt last year, so that's the thing. Bryce Love. He is one of 17 million backs in Washington, along with J.D. McKissick, I believe. Ty Johnson had a hype train around him last year that I think, looking back on now, of course, looking back on it's 2020, but it's kind of funny. And then Justice Hill. Do we think that any of these guys are gonna really matter for anything, or is this roster top heavy enough to get it to where it needs to get?
I mean, I like where it stands. I think probably the most interesting spot on that, or where people are gonna have the biggest gap, is probably Justice Hill. I think Baltimore could be like a sneaky team to draft a running back in the first couple rounds.
Killing my Gus Edwards shares, man. You're really, really killing him. I need 100 useless touches, and you're just taking them away. All right.
I think at some point, do we really think Justice Hill is more than a satellite back? I mean, really? because like Ingram is on his second, I think his last season of his contract.
29 years old.
Gus Edwards is, I mean, fine. He's a grinder. He can get you touches. He can get you those 4 yards, but he's not a guy that like I'm like, oh yeah, I'm gonna lean on Gus Edwards here. So yeah, I mean, TJ's right, and this could be there's some later round running backs that like are intriguing. I mean, you have Eno Benjamin, who was like the toast of Devy leagues everywhere after 2018. And then all of a sudden 2019 happens and he's nothing. I mean, I guess Keyshawn Vaughn has gotten some name recognition. Who else? Lamichael Pirine is a sneaky pick late too. So, and imagine landing on a team that's going to be run first with Lamar Jackson. I mean, they're going to be impactful right away if they are picking a guy who's going to be even just a first and second down running back. They're going to have an impact right away. So that could be interesting. Maybe not next year, but in 2021, some of these later round running backs that maybe you need to pay attention to in your rookie drafts.
And Mark Ingram isn't a guy that's healthy all year, every year. Like what we kind of saw last year, him getting injured at the last portion of the season, that could happen potentially earlier in the season. There might be some room for another guy to come in and actually garner a decent amount of touches for a few weeks there. So now let's go into wide receivers. Michael Thomas, Kenny Golladay, Robert Woods, D.D. Westbrook. He was a huge hype guy last year. I don't know if you can call that a success or completely the other way around. I think he kind of produced what you would expect him to. Rashard Perriman, I mean, it depends what happens at wide receiver in New York, but I mean, there's still the Adam Gase effect there. Sean Hamilton, pretty sure he's going to be replaced this offseason. Deontay Harris, Russell Gage, none of these guys are moving the needle for me, but Michael Thomas, Kenny Golladay, Robert Woods, that's a solid 3. Beyond that, are you guys comfortable rolling out these guys as your wide receiver 4?
Who wrote in? What's the person's name that wrote in?
It's FF Long Snapper.
FF Long Snapper. Is FF Long Snapper asking if he's going to come in first or second place? Is that
we've had some of these guys like, here, let's just you can stroke my ego.
Yeah, you're going to come and you're going to win your league, man.
While I listen to this, I'm going to roster bait.
Yeah, you're getting a first round bye.
I mean, yeah, you have 3 potential wide receiver ones here, and if not, you're going to have 3 top 18. I think in barring injuries. I mean, the depth is something to leave you wanting, but when you have those top 3 in Westbrook, I feel pretty okay here, especially when you only have to start 2 wide receivers and a potential wide receiver at flex. So I would be like with your, and just looking ahead with your draft picks, 1.12, you can get a decent wide receiver there. So I would feel comfortable all around. Like, yes, you can make some depth moves here, but where you're at, you're sitting pretty good.
Going back to what you guys were talking about with roster baiting. Hey, TJ, we get downloads how we get downloads. All right. We'll take them any way it happens.
I'm saying it as I'm giving props.
No, this is an excellently constructed roster. Let's get into the picks just for the hell of it. 112, 201, 212. Stompy, what are you looking at the 112, at the 201 for a team like this?
Well, honestly, I mean, I'm the last person to ask here because once you get beyond those top 4 or 5 running backs, I am out. I don't like picking rookie wide receivers, but honestly, you could look at a rookie wide receiver as your wide receiver 5, and I think you'd feel pretty good. I mean, you're looking at probably Henry Ruggs, Justin Jefferson, T. Higgins, Denzel Mims territory. I don't hate that because I think all of those guys will be drafted by a team that needs them right away, and they will garner targets. Really, if you want to take a shot at maybe Clyde Edwards-Helaire will be there. That could be extremely interesting depending on landing spot. Keyshawn Vaughn's going late second, so you could reach A.J. Dillon as well. It just depends on where these running backs land and how this shifts after the draft. But personally, what I would do is if you're going to keep the picks, which I personally would trade them away to get let's just say Kenyon Drake, or you might be able to get a Devin Singletary. I don't know if somebody doesn't love Devin Singletary
before the draft. Make that move now.
Yes. But if you're going to keep the picks, take a wide receiver there as your like wide receiver 4 or 5. That gives you a little bit of depth there. And then I personally would reach, because of where you sit in terms of your quarterbacks, I personally would reach for a running back if you have to. If like Clyde Edwards-Helaire is not there, I would reach for somebody like A.J. Dillon or Keyshawn Vaughn, and possibly even Eno Benjamin, because I actually like him a lot better than most people, but I think you can wait on that for a later round.
Anybody writing any fairy tales for Brandon Ayuk or Michael Pittman?
I don't know what to think of Ayuk. He's a down the field threat mostly for me. And I just don't know what kind of impact he's going to make right away. I suppose he could be more of a return guy than anything. I believe he was a return guy for ASU, but that's tough. Ayuk's tough. I mean, when now you're getting into guessing, like I think Laviska Shenault for me, maybe Brian Edwards. It's kind of that line where it's like, I'm comfortable with these guys at wide receiver as a rookie, but beyond that, it's like, you're taking a risk, especially in the second round with guys like Ayuk and Michael Pittman.
Yeah, I'm a little bit out of my lane here in terms of like valuing dynasty picks, but I mean, probably the weak spot on this roster is wide receiver depth. I mean, if you could find somebody that is really like gung-ho about draft picks and you could parlay that into a solid but boring wide receiver too, I'd be really interested in trying to do that. Like, you're so set at every position that you don't even need all your picks right now. Then who knows what you can parlay a 2021 early round pick into. You could find a solid wide receiver too to give you depth here and probably start in your flex.
So you're selling the farm for Jarvis Landry?
I'm not kidding, Jarvis Landry. I would really, really like at least try to test the waters on the Juju owner and see what he feels about him right now.
So Clyde Edwards-Helaire, according to Dill F ADP, going 2 picks behind Michael Gallup, 4 picks ahead of Christian Kirk and Terry McLaurin. I understand it's a little bit different when you put the name to the pick, but if that's the area that you're looking at, you have Woods, so you don't even have to do that. But Jarvis Landry's back there too. So yeah, I mean, getting 1.12 and getting a wide receiver out of that, like in that realm, like Christian Kirk, Michael Gallup.
Dude, if you can get
Jarvis
a Christian
Landry
Kirk or a Michael Gallup for that, like that's a snap call.
Right. So yeah, if you can find somebody like that, that's a perfect play actually.
Yeah, anytime you have a roster that's this good, you probably should be selling picks. You should be selling uncertainty for things that you do know, because you're so close to already winning the title anyway. You just need to make sure you have that guy for when one of these guys goes down with injury or something else unforeseen happens. So when you're in a situation with a win now roster to this level, you need to play like a win now dynasty owner, and you need to go ahead and sell the future for the immediate future, because that's going to be more profitable for you, and you can bank your rebuilding seasons early. All right, so most important part of the show, TJ. This is called the Dynasty Diagnostic. We're currently in the service center right now. This roster is a car. It's an automobile of some sort. So what is this to you in car jargon?
I mean, all you have to do is keep maintaining this thing. Like, just keep getting your regular oil change, rotate your tires so they don't go bald. If your front tires get bald first, so make sure you just keep rotating those things. But I mean, I think if we're just rotating those picks for some depth like you talked about, that's just the maintenance you need, right?
Absolutely. What about you, Sam?
So this is kind of like a nice truck that you've maintained well. It's clean. It's up to date on all of the maintenance, the PMs that it needs. And really all you're looking for is to add some accessories, lift kit, some bigger rims, put a nice sound system in there and so things that you don't need, but absolutely need, but that you can add to make this thing look as good as it can get.
This is like a 2000s Escalade, and the rims are still spinning. They're still spinning and spinning and spinning because this car is everything that you would want. You don't have an issue. You don't have any real problems with it. Like TJ and Sam said, it's just about maintaining it. It's just about backfilling that roster just a little bit so you have a little bit more safety when people go down, when things don't necessarily go the way that we expect them to right now. And if the rookie draft somehow screws you in devaluing one of your players like a Rashad Penny or anyone else we can even point to right now. But yeah, it's just about getting one or two pieces to kind of just solidify what you've got here as one of the top teams in the league. But thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for getting this far with us. Thank you, TJ, for joining us. Really, really appreciated you coming on. You can find me on Twitter at Aton Alive. You can find Sam on Twitter at FF Stompy. TJ Hernandez is on Twitter at TJ Hernandez. Again, just go ahead and find Stewie. You'll find him. And that is going to be it for today. Please make sure you follow your head technicians. As I just said, please go to the Dynasty Diagnostic podcast feed on iTunes. Give us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps the podcast grow and reach more listeners. Go ahead and go to our Patreon. Go to our store, envy.com, FF Pod Shirt store. That's Dynasty Outhouse's store. And make sure that you are aware that 10% of all the proceeds go directly to Scott Fish's charity, Fantasy Cares. So try to help the community along with that as we're all dealing with this coronavirus pandemic situation that has us all in our houses and able to do 2-hour podcasts. Thank you so much again for listening. Thank you for making it to the Dynasty Diagnostic Service Center today. And please be sure to keep up with your scheduled maintenance and catch us next time to ensure quality performance. And again, donate to Patreon. If you're watching right now, if you see my camera just buzzing in and out, maybe you can buy me a new camera on Patreon. But see you on your next visit.